That night, the ranch lay wrapped in a deep silence, broken only by the creak of the windmill and the soft nicker of horses in the corral. The men who had stood with Ethan bedded down early, worn thin by the fight, but sleep did not come so easy for him or Clara. They sat together on the porch, a lantern glowing between them, the prairie spread wide and endless under a blanket of stars. Clara leaned back against the rail, her hair tumbling loose from its pins, her shotgun propped harmlessly against the wall now. Her hands were still raw from the recoil, but she held her head high. "I didn't think I had it in me," she said softly, almost to herself. "To face a man like Holloway. To pull the trigger." Ethan turned toward her, his eyes steady, the lamplight catching the tired lines of his face. "You had it in you all along, Clara. All you needed was someone to remind you what you were worth." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not just the rancher who had pulled her into safety months ago, not just the man who worked the land with calloused hands, but the one who had chosen her, defended her, and trusted her strength as much as his own. Her throat tightened, but she managed a smile. "You make it sound like I'm more than just a cook." Ethan reached across the lantern and took her hand, rough fingers brushing the dust from her knuckles. "You're not just a cook. You're the reason this place is alive. You're the reason I'm alive. And if you'll have me, I'd be proud to call you my wife." The words hung in the warm night air, heavier than bullets, brighter than fire. Clara felt her eyes sting, her heart hammering, but she didn't hesitate. "Yes, Ethan, I'll have you, for as long as the prairie rolls and the stars burn above it." He pulled her close then, no colt in his hand, no danger on the wind, just a kiss as steady and sure as the land itself. For the first time in years, Clara's song rose in her chest, not for sorrow, not for loneliness, but for joy. She sang it softly against his shoulder, and Ethan listened with closed eyes, knowing her voice would be the only music he'd ever need. The wedding day dawned bright, the sky wide and cloudless, as though the prairie itself had laid out its blessing. Word had spread fast after the fight with Holloway, and when Ethan and Clara set the date, neighbors from miles around promised to come. By mid-morning, wagons creaked up the lane, horses tied to fence posts, children running through the dust with laughter that rang like bells. The ranch that had once sat lonely under the sun now brimmed with life. Clara stood in the small bedroom she had claimed months ago, smoothing the simple white dress a neighbor woman had sewn for her. It was plain, but the fabric caught the light like river water, and with her hair pinned neat in a ribbon at her waist, she looked every bit the bride she had once never dared to imagine. Outside, she could hear the low murmur of voices, the tuning of a fiddle, the scrape of boots on the porch. For a moment, nerves fluttered in her chest. Then Ethan's laugh carried across the yard, strong and sure, and the fear melted away. The ceremony was held under the cottonwoods by the creek, the same place where Clara had first touched his hand while washing clothes. A preacher from town read the vows, his voice steady as the current, but it was Clara's song that stilled every soul present. When asked if she would take Ethan Dawson as her husband, she answered not just with words but with a soft hymn she had carried in her heart for years, a song of longing, of finding, of belonging. The notes floated through the branches, and there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Ethan's answer was simpler, but it shook the air, "I will. With all I am." When they kissed, the crowd erupted, cheers, hats tossed in the air, the fiddle striking up a tune that set boots stomping and hands clapping. Neighbors laid out pies and stews, bottles of whiskey passed down the line, children darting through the grass with ribbons streaming. It wasn't grand, but it was honest, and for Ethan and Clara, it was perfect. As dusk fell and lanterns lit the yard, Ethan led Clara out for the first dance. His hand was steady at her waist, her head resting against his chest, and the whole world seemed to hush for a moment. The long fight, the whispers, the loneliness, they were behind them now. Ahead stretched a life built not on dust and silence, but on love as strong and wide as the land itself. The celebration lasted long into the night, neighbors laughing, fiddles sawing out tunes, children falling asleep in hay wagons while their parents clapped and sang. But as the last lanterns burned low and the final wagon rattled off into the dark, the ranch grew quiet again. The house, once filled with strangers and sound, now held only the hush of crickets and the low sigh of the wind. Ethan led Clara inside, his hand warm around hers, the floorboards creaking under their boots. For a moment they stood in the kitchen, the room where she had first claimed her place months ago. Clara glanced at the stove, the shelves lined with jars she had filled, the table where they'd shared so many meals. "This is where it began," she said softly. Ethan shook his head, stepping closer, his voice low. "No, It began the first time you sang. That's when I knew I couldn't live without you. He kissed her then, slow and reverent, the weight of all their struggles poured into that single touch. When he pulled back, his eyes burned with the fire of a man who had found his home. You're my wife now, Clara Dawson. And I'll spend the rest of my days proving worthy of you. Her hands framed his face, her voice trembling with both laughter and tears. And I'll spend mine reminding you you're already enough. They made their way to the small bedroom, the air heavy with the scent of wild sage drifting through the open window. The bed was simple, the quilt hand-stitched, but to them it was finer than any palace. Ethan's hands shook slightly as he untied her ribbon, not from uncertainty but from awe. Clara, unafraid, reached for him in turn, her song rising not in words this time but in the sighs and whispers shared between them. Outside, the prairie stretched endless, the stars burning bright above. Inside, two lonely souls who had found each other became one, no past shame, no future threat, only the steady promise of love strong enough to weather every storm. The world had been cruel, but tonight, it was theirs. Years rolled by, marked not by hardship alone but by the steady rhythm of seasons. The ranch that once groaned under loneliness now rang with the laughter of children. Ethan and Clara built it together, new barns, stronger fences, and fields that bore more than they ever thought possible. Neighbors still talked about the day Holloway tried to break them, but his name faded into dust, while theirs grew into a story told with respect. By the cottonwoods near the creek, two boys wrestled in the grass, their boots kicked off, their shirts streaked with dirt. Nearby, a little girl with her mother's brown eyes sang to herself as she wove flowers into her hair. Clara watched from the porch, her hands busy with mending, but her heart too full to contain. Her voice, once sung in sorrow, now rose in joy, drifting across the land like a blessing. Ethan, older now, his shoulders broader with years of toil, leaned against the post and listened with that same quiet awe he'd felt the first night she ever sang. At sunset, when the work was done and the children settled, Ethan and Clara walked out to the pasture hand in hand. The land stretched before them, endless, golden, alive. He squeezed her fingers and said, as he had so many times, I couldn't have done any of this without you. She smiled, leaning into him, her hair silvered by the fading light. No, Ethan, we did it together. That's the only way anything lasts. The stars rose, the same stars that had watched them on their wedding night. And beneath their glow stood a man and a woman who had once been lonely strangers, now bound by love, family, and a life carved out of dust and song. The prairie was still harsh, the storms still came, but Ethan and Clara faced it all as they always had, together. And when their children's children sang her old songs by firelight, the words carried more than melody. They carried a legacy, born of two souls who had once saved each other and, in doing so, saved everything that mattered. Decades slipped away, the prairie reshaping itself but never losing its wild, untamed spirit. Ethan's hair turned silver, Clara's songs grew softer, yet the ranch remained alive, passed into the hands of their children, who had been raised on hard work and the steady fire of their parents' love. Their eldest, Samuel, carried Ethan's broad shoulders and steady hands. He expanded the herd, driving cattle north to markets that Ethan had only dreamed of reaching. Where Ethan had fought for survival, Samuel built for prosperity. But at every branding fire, when he lifted a calf's ear to market, he thought of his father's words, we keep what's ours. Together. The second son, Jacob, had Clara's quick wit and her restless spirit. He rode further west, chasing the call of new land and new skies, but he always came back in the spring. At night, sitting under the cottonwoods, he'd play the fiddle while Clara sang, old ballads woven now with joy instead of sorrow. His journeys spread the Dawson name to places far beyond their stretch of prairie. And their daughter, Mary, became the true keeper of her mother's voice. She sang at barn dances, at weddings, even at funerals, her songs carrying the weight of history. Folks swore her voice could calm a frightened horse or ease a grieving heart. When she married a schoolteacher and helped raise the first little schoolhouse near the ranch, she taught not just letters but songs, the same ones Clara had once sung in lonely nights, now carried by a whole new generation. As the years passed, Ethan and Clara watched their family spread like wildflowers across the land, each child carrying a piece of them forward. The Dawson Ranch was no longer just a patch of dirt and cattle, it was a legacy. A place where neighbors gathered, where stories were told, where the land bore witness to the triumph of love over loneliness. And when the day came that Ethan and Clara were laid to rest side by side under the cottonwoods, their children and grandchildren stood hand in hand, singing her songs into the wide prairie sky. The sound carried for miles, echoing across hills and valleys, a reminder that even in the harshest land, love could take root and grow strong enough to outlive the dust. By the time Ethan and Clara's grandchildren were grown, the world around them was shifting fast. The iron rails of the railroad cut across the plains, bringing with them new settlers, merchants, and lawmen. What had once been wilderness now bustled with towns, saloons, and telegraph lines. The frontier was shrinking, but the Dawsons' land still stretched wide and free, a stubborn reminder of the days when men and women carved life out of dust and faith. Samuel's son, Thomas Dawson, was the first to ride the train east, seeking education in places his grandfather had only heard about in passing. He returned years later with spectacles perched on his nose, a stack of books under his arm, and a determination to blend progress with tradition. He brought windmills to pump water, barbed wire to guard the cattle, and contracts that secured the ranch's place in the growing market. Neighbors scoffed at first, but when hard drought hit and the Dawson ranch endured, they saw his wisdom. Jacob's children carried the wandering spirit forward. One rode with the U.S. cavalry, chasing shadows of the old Indian wars, another settled in California, lured by the promise of gold and orange groves. But no matter how far they roamed, they returned in the summers, gathering beneath the cottonwoods where Clara's voice still seemed to linger on the evening breeze. The stories of their grandparents, of the lonely rancher and the singing cook, were told like scripture, each retelling keeping the memory alive. Mary's children built the heart of the community. The little schoolhouse she had once opened grew into a full church and hall, where her daughter led choirs that filled the valley with hymns. Folks said the Dawsons had a gift, not just for ranching, but for holding people together, for reminding them what it meant to belong. By the dawn of the new century, the Dawsons stood as one of the founding families of the territory. They weren't the richest, nor the most powerful, but their name was spoken with respect. And when visitors came through, stopping for water or trade, they often asked about the song that drifted across the prairie at night, sung by children who had never met Clara but carried her spirit in every note. The Old West was fading, swallowed by progress, but the Dawson story lived on. Because some legacies aren't written in ledgers or carved in stone, they're sung, soft and steady, across the generations. The turn of the century brought machines that rattled louder than cattle drives and skies filled with wires carrying voices faster than horses could gallop. But nothing tested the Dawson ranch like the years of the Great War. Thomas Dawson's two eldest sons rode east with rifles slung over their shoulders, bound for France. The prairie felt emptier without them, nights quieter, suppers lonelier, but the family carried on, just as Ethan and Clara had once done. Clara's song, passed down through Mary's children, was sung by the fire every evening, a prayer for safe return. When the boys came back, worn and changed, they found the land still standing because their sisters had held it together. Women who once baked bread and stitched quilts now rode fences, branded calves, and bargained with traders in town. The Dawsons learned that survival meant bending with the wind. Progress wasn't just about machines or contracts, it was about letting everyone's hands shape the work. But the harshest trial came in the 1930s, when the Dust Bowl turned the sky black. Crops withered, cattle starved, and neighbors fled east, leaving behind ghost homesteads. The Dawsons hunkered down, tying wet rags over their mouths, covering windows against the choking dust. Many thought the ranch would finally die then, swallowed by drought and despair. Yet, one night, with dust still swirling outside, Mary's granddaughter stood up in the dimly lit parlor and sang Clara's old song, clear, defiant, steady. The family joined in, one voice after another, until the sound drowned out the wind. That night, they chose not to give up. Through grit and faith, they endured. Windmills pumped deeper water, new seed survived where the old had failed, and the ranch, scarred but unbroken, stood into another generation. Folks passing through marveled not at the land or the cattle but at the family's spirit. The Dawsons don't quit, the neighbors said. They've got a song stronger than dust itself. By the time the world marched into another war, the Dawson name was more than a family, it was a legend, rooted deep in the soil, carried on in song, and remembered by every traveler who stopped to rest beneath the cottonwoods by the creek. By the 1950s, the world beyond the prairie had changed almost beyond recognition. Highways cut through valleys once crossed only by wagon ruts. Neon signs flickered in towns that had grown into cities, and cattle were no longer driven across open range but hauled in trucks to sprawling stockyards. Yet the Dawson Ranch still stood, its fences weathered but strong, its barns rebuilt after storms, its fields watered by windmills and pumps that hummed through the night. Ethan and Clara's great-grandchildren now ran the spread. Some wore crisp jeans and drove pickups instead of saddles, others studied agriculture in college before coming home with new methods and machines. But even with tractors churning the fields and electric lights glowing in the old farmhouse, the heart of the ranch hadn't changed. At supper, voices still rose together in song, the same ones Clara had once sung in loneliness, now carried in harmony by children who had never known a world without radios, cars, and airplanes. The land was not without trials. Drought came again in the 1970s, banks threatened foreclosure, and developers circled, eager to turn prairie into suburbs. Many old ranches fell, swallowed by progress. But the Dawsons stood their ground. "This land is more than dirt and grass," Thomas Dawson's grandson said at a county meeting. "It's our blood, our history, our song. You can't buy that." And the community, remembering generations of Dawsons who had stood with them through wars, storms, and hunger, rallied to protect the ranch. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Dawson name had become more than family, it was heritage. Schoolchildren in the county learned of Ethan and Clara, the lonely rancher and the singing cook whose love had planted roots deep in the soil. Travelers still stopped beneath the cottonwoods by the creek, where a small stone marker now stood, etched with simple words, "They built this place together." And every summer night, when the stars wheeled bright over the prairie, a new generation of Dawsons still gathered on the porch, guitars in hand, voices lifted in the old songs. They sang not just for themselves but for all who had come before, their music carrying into the wind like a promise, that even as the world rushed forward, love, family, and the land would endure. By the time the 21st century hit full stride, the Dawson Ranch had become something more than just a working spread. It was history written into the land itself. Satellite maps and GPS might trace its borders now, but its true boundaries were in the stories told, the songs sung, and the sweat laid down across generations. The family still ran cattle, still grew hay, still rode fence when storms rolled in, but they also opened their gates to visitors who came not just to see livestock but to touch the heart of the Old West still beating in a world of glass towers and concrete. Great-great-grandchildren now balanced smartphones in one hand and rope in the other, live streaming roundups to folks in cities who had never set foot on dirt. College students wrote theses about the Dawsons' legacy, tourists stood beneath the cottonwoods to hear the tale of Ethan and Clara, the lonely rancher and the cook whose song changed everything. And every evening, when the sun bled gold across the horizon, the family gathered on the wide porch, guitars and fiddles in hand, to sing Clara's old songs, now posted online, yet still as raw and real as when she sang them by firelight a century and a half before. Of course, the new world brought new trials. Land taxes bit hard, markets rose and fell, and droughts, made fiercer than ever, tested the ranch's endurance. Developers came again, waving offers that could have bought a dozen houses in town. But as always, the Dawsons held. "This isn't just where we live," one of Ethan's descendants told a reporter. "It's who we are. If we sell, we lose more than land, we lose our story." That quote spread far, stirring hearts across the country, and donations poured in to help preserve the ranch as a heritage site alongside its working cattle operation. Now, under the same wide sky where Ethan once rode alone and Clara once sang to ease her heart, children still run barefoot through the pastures, voices raised in laughter. The cottonwoods still whisper with the prairie wind, and at night, when the stars stretch endless above, the Dawsons' music carries out across the land. It is a sound older than highways, stronger than dust storms, and truer than time itself, the song of a family who loved, endured, and left behind a legacy no progress could erase. The West may be gone in books and maps, but on that ranch, it still lives, etched in the soil, carried in the air, and sung, always sung, by the bloodline of Ethan and Clara Dawson. Generations passed, until the old ranch no longer belonged to any one family but to the land itself. The Dawsons' blood still flowed in scattered descendants, teachers, writers, singers, dreamers, some who stayed, some who wandered. But even for those who never set foot on the prairie, the story endured. Ethan, the lonely rancher who wanted only a cook, and Clara, the woman whose song healed his heart, became more than names in a family Bible. They became myth. By the mid-22nd century, when the frontier was nothing but history books and holograms, schoolchildren still acted out plays of Clara's nightly songs and Ethan's quiet courage. Digital archives held recordings of Dawson voices, scratchy, half-lost ballads carried across time. Travelers, no matter how modern, still came to the cottonwoods by the creek, standing in silence before the weathered stone marker. Some swore if the wind was just right, you could still hear singing on the breeze. In an age of machines and cities that scrape the sky, people yearned for roots, for the simple truth of love carved out of hardship. And so the Dawson's tale became a touchstone, proof that even in the harshest deserts, two souls could find each other and build something that outlasted dust, war, drought, and change itself. Historians wrote of them, poets praised them, and families, none related by blood, taught their children the old songs as though they'd always belonged. The ranch itself, though transformed, remained. No longer a cattle spread, it became a sanctuary, a living museum where the land was preserved as it had been in the days of the first Dawsons. Children learned to ride ponies there, to rope, to sing by the firelight, carrying forward traditions older than their great-great-grandparents. And when the stars blazed above, the same stars that had watched Ethan and Clara a lifetime ago, their story rose with them, no longer just history, no longer just legend, but something eternal. A song sung by the land itself, whispering, "Love endures, always." By the time centuries blurred into memory, the Dawsons were no longer remembered as just a ranching family. Their tale had swelled into folklore, woven into the fabric of the West the way coyotes belong to moonlight and tumbleweeds to the wind. Travelers whispered it around campfires, storytellers shaped it into ballads, and children grew up hearing the tale as if it had happened just over the next ridge. Some said Ethan Dawson never truly died. They claimed on nights when the desert storms rolled in, you could see a lone rider moving against the lightning, tall in the saddle, keeping watch over the land. Others swore Clara's song still floated across the prairie, soft and haunting, guiding lost travelers back to safety. To skeptics, these were just stories. To those who listened closely, they were promises, echoes of a love too strong to be buried by time. The cottonwoods by the creek became a shrine. No church ever raised steeples there, yet pilgrims came all the same, ranchers, wanderers, lovers, tying ribbons to the branches, singing scraps of old songs, praying for courage or for love that could endure the way Ethan and Clarice had. Scholars wrote books about the Dawsons, while poets said their story wasn't just history, it was the West's beating heart. Generations later, when cities sprawled and the old prairies grew quieter, the legend still held. The Dawson tale had become more than a family saga, it was a parable, a reminder that the harshest deserts could bloom if two souls stood together. They were remembered not as saints or heroes, but as something even stronger, ordinary folk who had loved extraordinarily. And so the story lived on, sung by voices around firelight, whispered by winds through empty canyons, carried by stars that never stopped burning. Ethan, the lonely rancher. Clara, the woman whose song became eternal. Together, they were the West itself, wild, enduring, and unforgettable. And so the years became dust, the dust became story, and the story became song. No one knew anymore where history ended and legend began. All they knew was that somewhere on a lonely ranch, long ago, a man who had lost all hope heard a woman's song and chose to live again. From that seed, a family grew, a land endured, and a love took root so deep that even time itself could not cut it down. The cowboys who still ride the ranges say Ethan's shadow guards the ridgelines when storms threaten, rifle steady, hat brim low. The singers who pass through whisper that Clara's voice still rises with the wind at dusk, carrying warmth across the darkening prairie. And the children, wherever they are, whoever they come from, still learn her songs, not because they must, but because they feel like they've always been part of the world. So if you stand one night beneath a sky wide enough to swallow you whole, and the stars blaze like fire on black velvet, listen close. You may hear it, the steady hoofbeats of a rider who never left, and the soft, unending melody of a woman who turned loneliness into love. Together, they remind us what the West was, and what the heart still longs for, that in the harshest desert, love can bloom, endure, and become eternal. And that is how Ethan and Clara Dawson, the lonely rancher and the singing cook, crossed the border from mortal life into everlasting legend. Not kings, not saints, but something greater, proof that even ordinary souls can carve forever out of dust and song. Beneath the wide and burning sky, where desert winds forever sigh, a rancher rode with heart of stone, a lonely man, forever alone. But one soft night a song took flight, a voice that lit the dark with light. He found her there, with eyes so true, and love was born where sorrow grew. Through dust and drought, through war and flame, the Dawsons carved their steadfast name. With calloused hands, with hearts that bled, they built a home where angels tread. When time grew old and years rolled on, Their children kept the fire strong. And still the cottonwoods will sway, where Clara's song has never strayed. So listen close when the night wind calls, through canyon cracks and prairie halls. For love still rides where hoofbeats fall, and Clara's song still binds us all.